Ladies and gentlemen, I am the American Spy Fox, and today we are going to continue with the story of Nirvana, Chapter 6, Come As You Are, by Michael Azerrad. In the next video, we're going to continue with the nanny interview from the BBC documentary. We're going to look at Tom Grant's case file, among other things I've come across. But I know a lot of you out there were looking forward to hearing the Nirvana audiobook, so let us continue. I do elaborate. Sometimes I interrupt and I elaborate. I've gotten a lot of comments from people that they like it when I elaborate on the story, so I will be doing that. And instead of looking at me sitting on my couch, I'm going to play some 1989 Nirvana footage for you as I read the story. Hope you enjoy. Let's get started. Chapter 6. The band recorded the Blue EP in late summer of 1989 at the relatively upscale Music Source on Seattle's Capitol Hill, a 24-track studio that specialized in ad jingles and movie soundtrack work. The producer was Steve Fisk. Despite that show in Ellensburg with Jason's out-of-sync hair, Fisk changed his mind about Nirvana after Bruce Pavitt sent him a copy of Bleach. It was obvious, says Fisk, that it was a very good band. The band arrived with their instruments in tatters. Fisk recalls Chad and his mammoth North kit. The smallest guy in the band had the biggest, stupidest drum set in the Northwest, says Fisk. The kick drum was held together by miles and miles of duct tape because the bass had been used as a hatchet to chop the kick drum in half. The Blue Sessions were the last appearance, recorded or otherwise, of Chad's North drums. If you don't know what North drums are, here is a picture. They're the most ridiculous drums ever designed. I don't know what the point was. They look stupid. They sound stupid. They needed to go. The rest of the band's equipment was in sad shape too. Chris Bass had done a lot of aerial work and had obviously suffered a few too many crash landings. The pickups were nearly shot and one of his two speakers was almost completely destroyed. The other one was completely destroyed. They spent a lot of time trying to get everything to sound good, tripling up the guitars. Kurt was unsatisfied with the recording and later tried to re-record some of the tracks with their sound man, Craig Montgomery, but they didn't turn out well either. They wanted a top 40 drum sound, says Fisk. They were saying that out loud. They knew they were not doing a top 40 song, but they really liked the idea of having the snare completely jacked up. And as we know, later they would go to famous audio engineer Steve Albini to get that snare sound they wanted. The snare sound that Kurt wanted is the same snare sound you hear when you listen to the Pixies' Where Is My Mind. They recorded Even in His Youth, the unreleased Token Eastern song, and electric version of Polly that went unfinished, Stain, and Been a Sun. Only the last two made it into the EP, which also included the title track and Love Buzz, both culled from Bleach. The instantly catchy 2-minute wonder, Been a Sun, describes the plight of a girl whose parents would have preferred a boy. She should have died when she was born, Kurt sings, his vocal draped in most unsub-pop-like harmonies, total Lennon harmonies, right out of Rubber Soul, raves Fisk. Grunge, pop, and feelings of inferiority also merge on Stain. Self-hatred never sounded so catchy. It's easy to miss the fact that the song is simply the same verse repeated 3 times. Although a different, peppier version of Been a Sun, minus Chris' tasty bass solo, wound up on Incesticide, the version of Stain hails from the Fisk sessions. Yeah, if you've never thought about it before, go back, listen to Bleach. Often a song will only have like 12 to 15 words in it, maybe 17 at most, but Kurt repeats the words, but he sings them differently or with a different tone or with a scream, with a wail. He does it so flawlessly different each time that you forget that he's actually just repeating himself. And as Azerrad is saying, you also forget that some of these songs have a very somber undertone because they're so catchy. I've talked to a lot of women out there, by the way. female friends who claimed the same thing, that their parents would have preferred a boy. They felt like their brother was treated better than them. You should know it goes both ways. My parents loved girls, hated boys. So for me, it was the opposite. I should have been a daughter. I don't know if that makes anyone feel any better about their situation, but it does go both ways. The hypnotic Token Eastern song was a reaction to numerous critical observations that the band often favored Eastern modes, as in love buzz. The back cover shot of the EP, a strangely desolate shot of a doctor's examination table, was taken by Tracy in her gynecologist's office shortly after an examination. Then came the European tour with Tad. The two bands left Seattle for the first gig in Newcastle, England on October 20th, 1989. 11 guys, including the gigantic 300-pound-plus Tad Doyle, and all 6 feet and 7 inches of Krist Novoselic, crammed into a teeny Fiat van. At first it was all laughter and smiles, but then little things began to get on people's nerves. Some of the guys on the bus smoked, and they weren't always considerate of the guys who didn't. A kind of delirium swept through the van. One of the guys bought some dirty magazines on Hamburg's notorious Reeperbahn. I've never seen this word in my life. Coprophiliac? A coprophiliac's magazine, which got passed around the bus. Shit on me, the guy would bellow over and over, collapsing in laughter. But for Kurt and a few others, the joke got old real fast. So I guess we can assume that a coprophiliac is someone who likes to defecate on their partner. Two Girls in a Cup. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of the infamous Two Girls in a Cup. I've never watched it. I've only heard of it. I wouldn't want to watch it. They played 36 shows in 42 days. Nobody was eating very well, and the pace was grueling. It was hard to sleep sitting up in the fiendishly uncomfortable seats. Nirvana was frustrated by their perennially cruddy equipment, hobbled further by the fact that they were smashing it to bits every night and then repairing it on the bus the next day. To make matters worse, the tour manager usually insisted on going straight to the venue when they arrived in town, meaning that the bands couldn't catch some sleep in their hotel rooms while waiting their turn to do sound check. Instead, they waited around in the club for hours, cold, hungry, tired, while the PA system was constructed. That's ridiculous. You want your bands to play at top notch. You want them to be well rested. You take them to the hotel. You go deal with the PA system, and then the opening band can come first, and then the next band can come. As we know, Nirvana was the opening act, so unfortunately, Kurt and Krist and Chad would have been the first to be there anyway. And if you haven't listened to the last chapter, we actually talk about how Sub Pop made enough money to take the guys to Europe in that video, if you're interested. Lame Fest at the Moore Theater in Seattle is what started it all, and then they headed for the Astoria as well as other small clubs and venues. They will meet a guy named Tony the dancer. We're going to make a video about him too. Very interesting character. He's the guy you always see jumping around on stage, interpretive dancing he calls it, but it's really just like thrashing and seizing on stage. Doyle had chronic stomach problems. At least once a day, he would have to get the driver to stop on the highway while he got out to throw up. Everyone on the bus would watch him and do their own imitations of Doyle's hurling style. He was definitely the puke machine, Chad recalls, a never-ending vomitron. Although he didn't smoke hash like most of the other guys on the bus, Kurt got very withdrawn and would react to bad situations either by drinking or retreating behind a wall of sleep. I used to really enjoy sleep because I could just get away from pain that way, Kurt says. I used to sleep constantly. On tour, every time we got in the van, I'd fall asleep. Every time we got to a club and we were waiting for sound check, we would sleep. Either I'd go back to the hotel and sleep or stay at the club and sleep until right before we went on stage, so I didn't have to be in reality. Krist was constantly drunk and or stoned, while Chad, Krist claims, was kind of out of his mind. He was talking in weird voices and stuff. For his part, Chad says he always talked to himself. Once, a waitress in the restaurant where he worked caught him in the walk-in refrigerator talking to a lemon, and he insists that of all the people on the tour, he had the best time. His nomadic childhood was perfect training for touring. Chad's father was a radio DJ who often switched jobs, and they moved around to different cities quite a bit. The band was unprepared for the adulation they received in Europe. Although the UK press raved about Nirvana, the band had no idea that they had so many fans over there. They simply weren't getting any sales reports from their UK label. Never a good sign. That means they may be hiding accounting from you. Virtually every show was sold out. The venues were packed. There were lines around the block. Now, let me just stop for a moment. According to records that Rolling Stone got their hands on somehow, 1990, Kurt Cobain's tax return said he made $31,000. If you listen to Bruce Pavitt and Jonathan Poneman of Sub Pop, they talk about how they never marketed Bleach, but it just kept selling and selling and selling. They actually say it was the only band we had on our roster that would just keep selling records. They sold 40,000. Now that might not seem like a lot, but $6 to $10 a pop, you would think Kurt would have made more than $31,000. Then again, I don't know what their contract was. I don't know the cost of touring, blah, blah, blah. I do know that while on this tour, well, you'll find out soon. That was a crazy tour, says Krist with some understatement. During the first gig, Krist slammed his new bass on the stage out of frustration with a malfunctioning amp. The neck snapped off and went right through one of the speakers in Kurt's rented twin reverb amp. It went downhill from there. They played Berlin the day after the wall came down. Kurt smashed his guitar 6 songs into the set and walked off. I'm kind of glad he did, says Krist. I was really, really, really stoned. Kurt sent Tracy lots of postcards. There was one where he sketched a picture of a typical Italian toilet. There was no water, Tracy says, so there's just a toilet with a big stinky pile of shit. Another time he wrote, I love you, over and over again on a postcard and signed his name. Interesting. So while on this tour, this 89 tour, going into 90, Kurt Cobain is still very much in love with Tracy Marander. The way Poneman sees it, that tour was the beginning of the end of both bands' relationships with Sub Pop. Tad eventually signed to WEA Distributed Mechanic Records in 1992. In the midst of one of their infamous promotional schmooze tours, Poneman and Pavitt turned up at a show in Rome toward the end of the tour. In retrospect, Poneman realized the message that their arrival sent. There's Tad and Nirvana riding around in this crummy little van, says Poneman, and here come the moguls flying into Rome. We thought that we were lending emotional support, but from their perspective, I can see them thinking, these arrogant sons of bitches. We don't have any money. We're barely eating. We're riding around in this cramped van. We've got this fat lead singer who's throwing up all over the place, and you've got a crazy drunk bass player, and here comes the moguls. Yeah, that's pretty dick move. You send your bands on tour with no food, in a tiny little rental van, and then you fucking fly in. Like, oh my God, what were they thinking? Not coincidentally, the Rome show was the nadir of the tour. The PA was terrible, and so was the rented gear. Disgusted with the sound, the bad food, the cramped bus, the low pay, and the frenetic schedule, Kurt smashed his guitar 4 or 5 songs into the set, spanked through, walked off stage, and climbed onto a speaker stack. He had a nervous breakdown on stage, says Pavitt. He was just going to jump off. The bouncers were freaking out, and everybody was just begging him to come down. And he was, no, I'm just going to dive. He had really reached his limit. People literally saw a guy wig out in front of them who could break his neck if he didn't get it together. When the PA stack started to sway, Kurt clambered through the rafters, screaming at the audience the whole way until he reached the balcony, where he threatened to throw down a chair until someone took it away from him. He wound up backstage where someone from the venue was arguing with their tour manager over whether Kurt had broken some microphones. Kurt grabbed both mics, flung them to the ground, and began stomping on them. "Now they're broken," he said, and walked away. Then he told everyone in the entourage that he was quitting and he was going home, then put his hood over his head and burst into tears. Poneman took him out for some air. "I was walking around the club with him," Poneman recalls, "and he was saying, 'I just want to go home. I don't want to play for these people. These people are fucking idiots. They're stupid. They expect me to go up there and perform like a trained animal. I don't respect them. I want to be with my girlfriend, and I want to quit music. This is not what I'm about.'" Poneman assured him that the next time the band came to Europe, conditions would be far better. According to Kurt, the first words out of Poneman's mouth were, "Well, now that you're quitting Nirvana, we'd still be interested in you as a solo artist." Wow, what a dick. Krist and Chad also quit the band for a moment, but they all reconsidered and played the final 2 weeks of the tour. The next day, they took a train to Switzerland, and while Kurt was asleep, his shoes, his wallet, and most importantly, his passport were all stolen. "I don't think I have ever seen another human being look as absolutely miserable as Kurt Cobain did at that moment," says Poneman. He somehow got into Switzerland and got a new passport at the American embassy. Then they went to a music store in Geneva, and Poneman bought Kurt a new guitar. And then Kurt got so sick that they had to cancel a show. "He just needed some time off," says Krist. "I had a crutch, I had booze and hash, and he was straight." Chad, meanwhile, exhibited an almost Buddha-like serenity. No one could tell whether he was some sort of spiritual savant or just oblivious. Nirvana and Tad met up with the Mudhoney Tour for the final gig on December 3rd at the Astoria in London, dubbed the Lame Festival. Nirvana had one lousy guitar left, and it kept cutting out throughout the set, and Kurt had to keep stopping to fix it. "Nirvana's set was pretty fucked up," says Mudhoney drummer Danny Peters. "Chris was so angry that he swung his bass by the strap around his head. Eventually, the strap snapped, the guitar flew straight at Danny Peters' head, and he only barely managed to bat it out of his way. It stunk," is Chris' review of the show. "On a scale of 1 to 10, it was 0. The Melody Maker reviewer at the concert that night agreed. "It all falls apart when the lanky, rubber-legged, frog-like bassist starts making a jerk of himself," went the review. "He'll have to go." "As yet, I'm unmoved," the review concluded. Others remember the show far more fondly. Bruce Pavitt rates the show as one of the best Nirvana has ever done, while Jonathan Poneman insists, "To this day, it's one of the proudest moments in my life." Journalist Keith Cameron, then with the now defunct UK Music Weekly Sounds, recalls it this way: "It was one of these things where the hall is maybe half full when they started, but by the time they finished, everyone in the hall was listening and getting into the band," he says. "I just ran down the front and freaked out. It was the most amazing band I'd ever seen." What impressed me, Cameron continues, was the complete and utter tension that existed between the three people on stage. They thrived upon it. It was uncomfortable watching them sometimes. It was exhilarating and it was exciting because that was the nature of the music, but there was also an almost palpable sense of danger, that this whole thing could just fall apart any second, but it wasn't. And it was maintained throughout the set. There was never any relaxation from the first note to the last. At the end of the set, Kurt threw his guitar at Krist, who then smashed it with his bass as if he were hitting a baseball. Kurt's guitar completely disintegrated. "You see bands smash their equipment, and it's not a revelation," says Cameron, "but somehow with them, I'd never seen it done with any purpose before. It seemed the perfect way to end that show. You sort of wondered whether Kurt meant to hit Krist with his guitar, or was that how they planned it? You got the impression that it wasn't planned at all. That was what was so good about it. You got the impression that they were learning this for the first time and they were as much in the dark as anyone. But it was just perfect." During their visit to London, Nirvana did a session for Radio 1 DJ John Peel, including Love Buzz, About a Girl, Polly, and Spank Through. The British press had really started rolling in by this time, and the articles bet on the idea that the band came from rural white trash America. "They're a little bit gross and a little bit awesome," went one profile. What else would you be if you grew up in the backwoods redneck helltown of Aberdeen? Sub Pop played it up for all it was worth. You've got the 300-pound butcher hanging out with Kurt, the trailer trash kid, and you've got the moguls. We'd be posing in suits and ties, adding a little theater, says Bruce Pavitt. People got caught up in it. I can't remember what state Tad Doyle's from, but he is like a classically trained musician, and they dressed him up as like this lumberjack, like this fucking barbarian, when he's actually like this big teddy bear classic musician, classical musician. Kurt didn't like getting painted as some sort of idiot savant yokel one bit. To be thought of as this stump-dumb rocker dude from Aberdeen who just blindly found his way up to Seattle in this hip label, says Kurt, it just felt degrading to be thought of as someone like that when that was something I was fighting against all my life. They were totally manipulating people and trying to put this package together, says Kurt of Pavitt and Poneman. They've gotten so much credit for being these geniuses, these masterminds behind this whole thing, when it really had nothing to do with them. It really didn't. It had more to do with Charles Peterson's fuzzy pictures than it did with their attempts at making sure we appeared stupid in interviews. I always resented them for that. Kurt found Pavitt's professed populism far more condescending than brilliant. It was just obvious that he thought of himself as an educated, white, upper-middle-class punk rocker who knows everything, and I'm just this idiot from Aberdeen, Kurt says. That was always something that we sensed, and we totally resented him for it. They felt similarly about Poneman, too. To be fair, Pavitt and Poneman had seized on a brilliant idea that art and culture didn't have to be developed and transmitted solely from the media centers of New York and Los Angeles. The indie labels had proved that people in places like Minneapolis and Chicago and Seattle had just as much to say as any New York City media creature. For Poneman and Pavitt, finding someone from a place like Aberdeen who made valid art was like hitting the jackpot. They thrived on that, Kurt says. They were excited about it. They'd found these redneck kids from a coastal town that they could exploit, or at least use their image to their benefit. They didn't really want to find out if we were smarter than they wanted us to be, because that would ruin everything. Kurt might gripe a lot about Sub Pop, but he'll gladly acknowledge the crucial role the label and Jonathan Poneman in particular played in their career. Jonathan was really, really supportive of us from the very beginning, Kurt says. He wanted us to rule the world. After the tour, Kurt and Chad went home while Chris and Shelley flew to what was still called Yugoslavia to see Krist's father. Chris and Shelley got married soon after they got back home to Tacoma on December 30th, 1989. The ceremony, which was conducted by a woman Shelley knew from work, took place in the couple's Tacoma apartment. It was a small apartment, and it was packed. Besides Chris' mom and Shelley's mother and stepfather, there was Kurt and Tracy, Dan Peters, most of the guys from Tad, old friends, and some neighbors. Matt Lucan was Chris' best man. They got married, says Lucan, and then everybody got drunk. The reception was distinguished by an inebriated three-way wrestling match between Krist, Kurt Danielson, and Tad. After a brief California tour and some local gigs, the band went out on a U.S. tour, Chad's last. They each picked up Pixelvision toy video cameras and shot movies in the van to pass the time. They rented a U-Haul trailer, it was a total advancement in touring technology, says Krist, and put a love seat in the back. It was a big step up for the band. Now they had the whole van to themselves. They also had a t-shirt that reproduced John Lennon and Yoko Ono's infamous nude Two Virgins album cover, except sticking Bruce Pavitt and Jonathan Poneman's faces on the bodies. They headlined at clubs with a few hundred capacity, making a few $100s a night. Well, that's pretty good. They played all the same clubs they used to play, except now they had a tour manager, a roadie, and soundman Greg Montgomery working for them full-time. At first, the easygoing Montgomery was a little rattled by all the guitar smashing, but soon came to understand what it was all about. That's part of the fun of Nirvana, is the unpredictability, he says. If they didn't have that anger at some times, they wouldn't have that beauty at other times. By this time, people in important places were beginning to buzz about Nirvana. Indie world demigod Sonic Youth had seen the band on the Jason tour and had become big fans and ardent boosters in the press. Bassist Kim Gordon and guitarist Thurston Moore showed up at a gig in New York at the Pyramid Club, along with Geffen A&R, that's artists and repertoire, man Gary Gersh. Besides them, no one in the audience liked the band except for Iggy Pop, who had been brought to the gig by photographer Michael Levine. Pop hooted and hollered words of encouragement throughout the set, even though the band played miserably. In penance for the gig, Krist shaved his head in the cheap Jersey City motel the band was staying in, but not before they had started shooting a video for In Bloom, which can be found on the Sub Pop compilation entitled Sub Pop Video Network Program 1. In some scenes, Krist has hair, and in some others, he doesn't. So much for continuity. On April 27th, Tracy's birthday, Kurt called her from Amherst, Massachusetts to tell her that he did not want to live together anymore, but that he still wanted them to be boyfriend and girlfriend. Tracy knew something like this was coming. Near the end, we started fighting more and more, she says. He wanted me to be artistic, and I didn't have the time to be artistic. I was driving an hour to work and an hour back from work. I was supporting him, and he wasn't doing any housework. He'd say, just leave it. And I'd say, I can't leave it. I can leave it for a week or a few days, and then I can't stand it anymore. I have to clean it because you won't do it. A few days later in Florida, they met a kid who wanted to be on Sub Pop and who let them spend the night at his dad's luxury condo. That night, they did a lot of acid and drank a lot of Tom Collins drinks. Among other unspeakably strange and bizarre acts, Krist fried mayonnaise in a pan. The next morning, he found himself walking around the driveway, stark naked, bald, and yelling, "Cast away your possessions like I have. You're not worth anything." Kurt hustled him back into the house, got him dressed, and they scrambled out of there before their still unconscious host discovered all the damage they'd done. So yes, medieval times, probably maybe even in some communist-style countries to this day, shaving your head was shame, right? It was meant for penance. It was a punishment, and that's what Chris was doing. He played this terrible show, and he wanted to punish himself, so he shaved his head. I'm positive that's where the lyric comes from in Lithium. It's okay to shave your head. Okay. As far as Tracy, I do feel sorry for her. There was a very long period of time that Kurt Cobain was very creative and very artistic, and that was all thanks to Tracy Marander. He didn't have to work. Apparently, he wasn't even doing household chores. So he was just spending all of his time writing and playing guitar and painting and drawing, and I think that was really time he needed to develop as an artist. So Tracy Marander deserves a lot of credit in the making of Kurt Cobain, in my opinion. Although Sub Pop didn't promote Bleach as heavily as other albums out at the time, it was a steady seller. It was promoted for 2 months, and then, despite Kurt's request that the label stay on top of the record, Sub Pop went out to new projects. The label's relatively low-powered distribution and publicity were beginning to be a problem. Their records were hard to find. It's the typical story of showing up at gigs and 10 to 20 kids coming up to the stage and saying, "Hey, we can't find your record anywhere." Kurt says it got real tiring. "We didn't do any interviews. We felt we deserved a little bit more than we were getting. I would have been comfortable playing to 1,000 people. That was basically our goal, to get up to that size of a club, to be one of the most popular alternative rock bands like Sonic Youth." Kurt estimates they did about 3 interviews the entire time they were on the Sub Pop label. And Sub Pop was on the verge of going under. A distribution venture crashed and burned due to mismanagement. Also, they put a lot of their money into Green River. They promoted it, marketed it, printed all these Green River albums, and then the band became defunct. Of course, half went to Pearl Jam and half went to Mudhoney, right? Poneman and Pavitt's high-rolling promotional style was draining the company dry. Band members were raiding the stockroom and walking off with armloads of vinyl. The label was releasing a record a week while trying to keep too many bands on the road, and now that major labels were offering major label-sized advances to Seattle bands, Sub Pop felt compelled to try to match them. Sub Pop nearly went bankrupt. By the summer of 1990, they were bouncing $100 checks and owed money to everyone in Seattle. They hit rock bottom, Krist recalls. It was just such a mess. They tried really hard to pay us because they really appreciated us, and that's cool, but it was just too much of a burden for us. You gotta eat, right? Just like Tracy Miranda provided that home and that stability and that food for Kurt Cobain, these guys are on their own now. They gotta eat. And if you can't pay us, we'll go be on a label that can pay us. And further draining the label's coffers were Sub Pop's alleged legal negotiations. Neither Pavitt nor Poneman will comment on them to this day. For distribution deals with Columbia Records and Hollywood Records, at one point, Nirvana met with Sub Pop's attorney, who tried to convince them that it was a good arrangement. But the way Kurt and Krist saw it, it simply made more sense for them to choose their own label instead of someone else choosing it for them. We decided to cut out the middleman, says Kurt. No indie label could afford to buy Nirvana out of their Sub Pop contract, and besides, Sonic Youth and Dinosaur Jr., both bands of impeccable artistry and credibility, had recently signed to majors, so they began looking for a major label deal. When Poneman and Pavitt found out, they were deeply anguished. I can think of very few things that have happened in my life that have hurt my feelings more, says Pavitt. It really fucked with my head for a while. You're not a very shrewd businessman if that kind of thing is hurting your feelings. Like, what did you expect them to do? You weren't promoting them. You couldn't market them. That kids wanted to buy their record, and you weren't even producing the damn record and putting it in stores. Like, of course they're going to go to somebody else. What are you talking about, man? Pavitt says he and Poneman only found out about the group's plans through the grapevine. It was so obvious, Kurt replies. We wouldn't return their phone calls for weeks and weeks at a time. Every time I talked to Jonathan, I feel that I made it clear that there was definitely an uncertainty in our relationship. I just don't understand how you're expected to come right out and tell someone something like that. I suppose it's the more adult thing to do, to tell someone that you don't want to have anything to do with them anymore, but it's a really hard thing to do. I've always quit my jobs without any notice. I just quit one day. I just don't show up. Kurt admired Pavitt because he had an uncanny instinct for ferreting out great new underground music, bearing albums by Daniel Johnston and the Shags as proprietary offerings. Pavitt went down to Kurt's apartment in Olympia to try to talk to him into a newer, stronger contract. For the first time, Bruce actually seemed like a human being to me, says Kurt. Every other time I'd see Bruce Pavitt, our conversation was always really limited and we never got to talk to each other on a human level. I also felt a kind of resentment because why all of a sudden at that point did he decide to treat me like a person instead of this casualty every time I came into his office? Bruce Pavitt finally realizes he's going to lose Kurt Cobain. He finally realizes how much of a commodity Kurt Cobain is, a very, very valuable asset, and he tries to kiss his ass, but it doesn't work. Kurt says, well, I've tried to be your friend before, and you just kind of pushed me out of your office like I was nothing. Now that dollar signs are in your eyes, you want to be my buddy. And trick no good, ain't gonna work. They spoke for 5 tense hours. There was just beads of sweat on my forehead and everything, recalls Pavitt, and Kurt couldn't quite bring himself to tell Pavitt that he was absolutely sure he did not want to be on Sub Pop anymore. A few days later, Krist gave Sub Pop the definitive word. They were leaving. I felt really bad, says Kurt. I felt guilty because I wanted to be on their label still, because I knew that these are people who share similar thoughts. I kind of felt like the enemy at the time. But still, there was nothing that Pavitt was going to do that would change my mind. They were just too risky. Yeah, again, imagine you got this great band. You know that you're great. All your friends are telling you this is really good music. Your fans at your shows are saying, man, how can I buy your record? I'd listen to this in my car. Or how can I find the cassette tape or whatever? And your record label isn't doing anything for you. You got to go. Even if you like them, it's, don't mix personal relationships with business. By August, Soundgarden manager Susan Silver had also introduced them to lawyer Alan Mintz of the powerful Zifrin Brittenham and Bronca firm. Mintz had already engineered outstanding deals for Jane's Addiction and Faith No More. The whining and dining began. Charisma, Slash, and Capitol all wanted the band badly. MCA flew the band down to LA and flew a rep up to Seattle. Island A&R man Steve Pross had already been chasing Nirvana, but the band was thoroughly uninterested in Island. The labels were all excited about a tape the band had recorded in early April of 1990 at Smart Studios in Madison, Wisconsin, the home base of veteran underground producer Butch Big, an immensely nice man who had become highly regarded for his fierce-sounding but economical production work on albums by Killdozer, The Lapping Hyenas, The Fluid, Smashing Pumpkins, and who had produced records for labels like Touch and Go, Mammoth, Twin Tone, and Amphetamine Reptile Records. It would be in, I believe, around 92, 93 when janitor Joe, Krist and Fast Band, would be signed to Amphetamine Reptile Records. I've doted on that album before, Big Metal Birds. I know I've doted on it before. I'm going to do it again. Janitor Joe, Big Metal Birds. Check it out if you never have. It's a really cool album. He'd also produced Tad's excellent 8-Way Santa album for Sub Pop. Vig started with more pop records but adapted brilliantly to the mid-80s indie boom with its abrasive sounds and tight recording budgets. Jonathan Poneman had hyped Vig on Nirvana by saying, "These guys are going to be bigger than the Beatles." Kurt was very quiet and let Krist do most of the talking. Krist made it clear that the band wanted to sound very heavy. Vig began to sense a tension between Kurt and Chad, who couldn't quite do what Kurt wanted him to do. They spent a week recording 7 songs for what was supposed to be their second Sub Pop album, but which became, in effect, the demo tape they shopped to the major labels. The arrangements are virtually identical to the Nevermind versions. In fact, the version of Polly is the one that appears on Nevermind, although remixed. Breed was then called Imodium after the anti-diarrhea medicine Tad had used on the European tour. Stay Away was originally titled Pay to Play and featured slightly different lyrics, spectacular feedback, and a screaming kamikaze coda. Also recorded at Smart were In Bloom, Dive, and Lithium, which begins with Kurt playing the same rickety acoustic guitar that features on Polly and fades rather than stops. They also made another attempt at the elusive Sappy, a highly catchy tune about romantic entrapment. You're in a laundry room. You guys know that one. Vig was the perfect producer for the project. He could get nasty sounds, but he was also a self-described pop geek. In the indie scene, music as melodic and downright catchy as this was anathema. Almost by definition, underground music wasn't supposed to be easy to like. The songs on the Smart sessions were a bold step, as bold and experimental as any noisy angst fest, perhaps a lot more so. I think of them as pop songs, Kurt told one UK magazine. There are no songs as wild and heavy as Paper Cuts or Sifting on the new record. That's just too boring. I'd rather have a good hook. Both the songwriting and the recording weren't as rushed as Bleach had been, so Kurt had a lot of time to hone and polish the songs. I'd finally gotten to the point where I was mixing pop music with the heavy side of us in the right formula, says Kurt. It was working really well, mostly because of the reports from our friends and other bands. Everyone was saying that it was really good. I could tell that it was definitely more advanced than Bleach. He's saying he could tell that his songs for Nevermind are... He's developing as an artist. He's honing his skills. He's becoming better. And he could tell that they were better by the reaction from people around him. But Kurt and Krist were growing more and more unhappy with Chad's drumming. This time, Kurt had the time to make sure that Chad played the parts that he had taught him. Just want to interrupt real quick. I find this interesting. Because really, in no other interview or anything have I read where, we know that Kurt and Krist were unhappy with Chad's drumming. We know that. But here it says Kurt would make up the drum parts, teach them to Chad. Now, listen to this. Let me read the next couple sentences. During the low-budget Bleach sessions, Chad would change his parts, and there was no time to argue or do another take. So what they're saying is Bleach was very rushed, very low budget. We just get in and get out as quickly as we can because we have no freaking money. We have no management. We have no advance paycheck. We have nothing. And Chad knew this. So he actually, instead of doing what the drum parts that Kurt taught him and wanted him to play for the songs for Bleach, he did his own thing. So it makes you wonder what Kurt's saying is, for the Smart session, the demo for Nevermind, we had all the time in the world, and I taught the drum parts that I wanted Chad to play to him, and he couldn't just go in there and change it at the last minute. We had plenty of time, right? So did Chad Channing come up with the or the lithium drum beat, or the other drum beats that I've attributed to him, that Dave Grohl has attributed to him? Perhaps it was actually Kurt Cobain that made up those iconic drum parts, made Chad play them, and then Dave duplicated Chad. Something to think about, right? Kurt started out as a drummer. He was a pretty damn good drummer. I was really hoping to participate more and become part of what was going on, says Chad, at least to have a say in how my own drums sounded. There you go. So he's saying I wasn't even playing the drums I wanted to play. I was playing the drums Kurt wanted me to play. So possibly we've attributed these drums to the wrong person. Possibly we should be attributing the cool drums from Nevermind to Kurt Cobain. I wanted to get more involved in the band and feel like I was actually doing something. I was still happy dealing with the album, but I wanted to be more a part of it. It was then that I realized that it really is Kurt's show, and that what he says goes, and that's it. No questions asked. Chad, who could play guitar, bass, and violin, was also a songwriter and wanted to start contributing material to the band. But even though he was into a lot of the same music that Krist and Kurt were, the Young Marble Giants, the Beatles, Scratch Acid, and the Butthole Surfers, his songwriting style defined the Bainbridge Island sound, which Chad had helped to create before joining Nirvana. And also in an upcoming Rare Facts Nirvana video, I have plenty more rare facts about Nirvana. We're going to be talking about Chad Channing and his musical career before Nirvana. There's a couple surprising facts to do with that. And he did have a lot to do with what was going on in that local community's music scene. And he played with somebody more specifically that I want to talk about. So Kurt describes Chad's music as Krist describes it as ultra quirky, pastoral, vaguely prog rock. Kurt calls it elfin music. You just kind of shudder because it's so stupid and dorky. Kurt says they were open to other material, but Chad's music didn't fit the band. It just wasn't good, says Kurt, and there was nothing else to be said about it. It was really sad because he felt like he wasn't part of the band because he couldn't really create. And so Chad wound up living out a time-honored rock biz joke. Question: what was the last thing the drummer said before he was fired? Hey guys, I wrote some songs I want us to play. By late May, after the US tour had ended, Nirvana had started to attract the attention of major labels. Bootlegs of the demo circulated around the music industry, and even though they were hardly as polished as the finished Nevermind recordings would be, the buzz was loud. Ironically, Sub Pop had probably helped spread the buzz about Nirvana by touting the band as a valuable property to labels they wanted to do a distribution agreement with. And that's when Kurt and Krist chose to fire Chad Channing. Nervous and sad, they took the 35-minute ferry ride from Seattle to Chad's house on Bainbridge Island to give him the bad news. They told him, Krist did most of the talking, gave him a hug goodbye, and then they left. I felt like I'd just killed somebody, says Kurt. Chad's take on the meeting is that he wasn't fired, he quit. We talked for a while and I just told them this was how I felt and they knew that, he says. It wasn't like we weren't getting along. We always got along as human beings. It was strictly along the musical line that it just wasn't working anymore. That's where it ended, right there. I never felt like I was totally in the band anyway. I felt like I was just the drummer. I was thinking, why don't they get a drum machine? Get it over with. Then they could program it and do any damn thing they wanted. Sometimes I just felt sorry for Chad, says Bruce Pavitt. You could tell that I didn't feel that they treated him with a lot of respect. And they did, you could tell they picked on Chad a lot. There's even that, famous interview where Kurt tells Chad, they say, Jason's gone. He went to Soundgarden. And then Kurt looks at Chad and says, you're next. You could tell they kind of picked on him a little bit, but he seemed to take it well. Even though Kurt thought Chad was a really nice guy, he never got along with him. Kurt suspects Chad didn't get along with him for some of the same reasons that Jason didn't. Kurt was still prone to being volatile, getting drunk and turning into a negative creep. I was just trying to be punk rock or something, Kurt admits. I had this terrible Johnny Rotten complex. Johnny Rotten, the incredibly infamous asshole from the Sex Pistols. Chad used to be the mellow, quasi-hippie Bainbridge Island scene. Couldn't relate to such a sarcastic pessimist like Kurt. Kurt was still openly judgmental, quick to point out people's faults, something Chad frowned upon. Kurt knew he had a problem, and he tried hard to contain it, but couldn't always, especially when talking about their crude Seattle sludge rockers, Blood Circus. Early on, for some reason, Sub Pop thought that Blood Circus was like even more so than Mudhoney. Sub Pop like really put a lot of money into Blood Circus, and Kurt and Krist had to stand there and watch this terribly shitty band get all this attention when they felt they were the better band, and that's why Kurt held resentment towards Blood Circus, whose early success... Okay, so let me start that over. He couldn't, especially when talking about the crude Seattle sludge rockers Blood Circus, whose early success baffled Kurt and Krist. It was almost impossible for me to get along on any level with Chad because I basically couldn't say anything without offending him. Does that sound familiar, everyone? You can't get online and say anything without offending some damn person. So this was in the early 90s. Chad was the ultra leftist fucking quasi hippie PC pussy in the 80s and 90s, and it came from the hippie Bainbridge Island. But that's not to say I don't think he's a cool guy. I'm just I'm saying I think it would be very easy to offend Chad Channing, and that's him and Kurt just came from different worlds. Kurt was still openly judgmental, blah blah blah, Blood Circus. I thought he was judging me for judging other people. Their mutual animosity grew, although they would never say it was. What an asshole, Chad would think to himself. What a hippie, Kurt thought. Kurt had played drums for years, so he was very picky about drumming. He didn't think much of Chad's playing, and that further fueled his animosity. He really had bad timing, and he wasn't a very powerful drummer, says Kurt. Kurt liked Chad much better than any of the other drummers they'd had, so he encouraged him to take lessons so he could improve. Kurt also says that Chad would tire quickly and start to make more and more mistakes as the set wore on. Often there would be interminable delays while Chad returned to his drums, although Kurt insists he was really resting. Sometimes there would be weird things, says Krist. He'd go off in space. There wouldn't even be a drum beat anymore. And I remember looking over at Kurt and Kurt looking over at me, and we're like, what the fuck was that? Yeah, so I am a drummer, and I've been playing since I was about 12 or 13 years old. And if you're a musician as well, whether you're a bassist, a guitarist, vocalist, chances are when you listen to a song for the first time, the most prominent thing you hear is the instrument you play. Like whenever I hear a new song, or hell, even when I'm listening to music I've listened to 1,000 times over, I hear the drums more than anything. And I can tell you that watching early Nirvana shows at these clubs they were playing with Chad Channing, he has terrible timing. Now, if you're not a drummer, you may think, no, he's good. I like Chad's drumming. But as a drummer and even as a guitarist, you know, like, and the longer they play, the more his timing fucks up. Kurt actually asked Chad to take lessons. All he had to do was practice to a metronome, really. If you have bad timing, you just practice to a metronome. That's how you fix that. But for whatever reason, Chad refused to do it. I mean, Kurt gave him the chance. He said, take some time, take some lessons, get your timing better, hit harder. And Chad refused to do it. As we learned in this chapter, Kurt wanted Chad to play very specific drum parts for songs on Bleach, knowing that they'd only get basically 1 day to record this album, one take. He went in there and did what he wanted to do instead of what Kurt wanted him to do. It'd be very interesting to hear the Bleach album with the drum parts that Kurt wanted Chad to play. You know what I'm saying? Anyway, I I don't know. I really do think that if Chad would have just practiced harder and maybe started practicing to a metronome, maybe put a little more ass into it, I think maybe he would have stayed with Nirvana. But possibly they just didn't like touring with him because, they're rough. They're rough and tumble guys from a rough town, and you got to be tough. You get picked on, you get bullied, you got to get back up on your feet, and Kurt could give it as well as he could take it. Chad grew up in this I will just call it a bubble. You guys know what I'm saying. That really is how the instrument smashing came about, says Kurt. I'd get so pissed off at Chad that I'd jump into the drum set, then smash my guitar. Early videotapes of the band show that sets often ended with someone hurling a guitar or a guitar case at Chad, soon followed by Kurt or Krist sailing into the drum kit. Krist is still slightly evasive when explaining why Chad got the sack. At first, he chalks it up to good old-fashioned musical differences. He kind of wanted to do his own thing, he says, adding that Chad was a light jazzy drummer by nature and had to alter his style in order to play to Nirvana. We needed a real thumper, but on the Vig demo, Chad hit very hard, truth be told. Dave Grohl virtually duplicated all his parts for Nevermind. This is what I was getting at. We know, Chad tells us, for Bleach, Kurt wanted me to do very specific drum parts, but I didn't. I was rebellious. I went in there at the last minute, knowing that he couldn't change it, and I did my own shit. For Nevermind, they had much more leniency, much more time, much more money. So it wasn't just like this, okay, let's get this over with as quickly as we can. Kurt could be there and say, nope, I don't want you to play those drum parts. I want you to play my drum parts, right? So then Dave comes along and duplicates what Chad Channing did. But according to this book, Chad Channing was doing what Kurt Cobain wanted him to do. So again, do we think Dave Grohl? Do we think Chad Channing? Do we think Kurt Cobain? Or maybe it was a combination of all three of them? We've been through a lot with this whole success thing, with all the pressure and stuff, Chris continues. I'm just glad Chad didn't have to go through all that because... And he trails off. It was always kind of awkward with Chad. It was weird. I don't regret it at all, though. He just wanted to do his own thing. He had a different perspective than us. A lot of times he had a way better perspective than us. Way more objective and way more innocent and good. We were going to make this big step, sign to a major label, and he wasn't right for us. It just wasn't right. Even when I look at it now, says Chad, I don't regret anything. I'd probably be pretty damn wealthy. But would I be happy? That's the question mark there. It's kind of weird, he continues. I mean, I could be there, but I'm not. But at the same time, I'm happy for them. I would have been bummed if it just petered out and the band broke up. I hope they're enjoying themselves and that the pressures aren't too much. A bit of foreshadowing there. The bad feelings seem to be few. Overall, I have massive love for that guy, says Kurt. I kind of admire him because he's really satisfied with the way that he is. He seems like a really happy person, and he always has been. Chad now plays in a fine band called Fire Ants and made a tidy sum from the royalties of Bleach and Incesticide. Now, I've expressed this opinion before. I think Chad should get some credit on Nevermind because actually... Even Butch Vig came out within the last couple years and said a couple of the tracks that are on Nevermind, they weren't even sure if it was Dave or Chad. As a matter of fact, they were pretty sure it was Chad on a couple of tracks on Nevermind from the, songs that were remixed from the Smart Studios. So I always felt like Chad should have been inducted to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. I think he should have got at least a small percentage of royalties from Nevermind. This is my beef. As a musician, I think it sucks that if a guy is a guitarist and he writes a guitar part and another guy in a band wants to play it, you could sue him. Copyright, that's my song. I wrote that. Bassist does the same thing. Vocalist can do the same thing. But when it comes to drums can be duplicated. And it's like, you can't sue. There's no copyright. It's kind of shitty. Like, I get it. I could play 2 different beats for you, and like every pop song you've ever heard consists of these 2 beats. Okay, think of Michael Jackson's Billie Jean. That beat is in like every pop song and variations of it, okay? The 4/4 rock beat, disco beat, if you will. But think about the iconic drums, like the In Bloom, cat, dun, dun, like shit like that. That was copied. Whether that originally came from Kurt and he taught it to Chad, or Chad came up with it himself, we don't know. According to this book, it probably was Kurt. But still, Chad should have got some credit. Like, these are the drums on Nevermind are very, very iconic, very well known. Matter of fact, you can hear the drums without hearing the guitar or the vocals and know what song it is, right? So I think when it comes to very unique drum fills and or beats, that should be something that can be copyrighted. Just my opinion. Or at the very least, if a new drummer comes along, they got to give you credit. They got to share their royalties, whatever. But we do now, to end that on a happy note, Bleach and Incesticide have now sold millions of copies. So by now, by 2022, Chad Channing's probably rich after all these years of receiving royalties from those two albums. Pretty sure he's sitting comfortably at this point in time. Now, back in, this book was written in 92. It wasn't released till 93. Way back then, hardly anybody cared about Bleach or Incesticide. Only the real diehard underground fans cared about Bleach and Incesticide. Nowadays, they're like, if you're going to buy a Nirvana album, you got to buy all of them, right? So yeah, Chad may have not have been getting very big paychecks in the early 90s, but I guarantee he's sitting pretty now. And you know what? Good for him. Because he got beat up and picked on a lot by Kurt and Krist. He deserves it. Without a drummer, they canceled a proposed March 1990 UK tour and asked Dale Crover to fill in on a 7-date West Coast tour with Sonic Youth in mid-August. Crover agreed to play, but on one condition. I told them, whatever you do not jump into my drum set. Do not. Not only did they comply with that request, but they also did not smash one guitar on that tour. I'm glad they didn't do that stuff, says Crover. I'd seen them do it before, and I just thought it was anticlimactic. Kurt trying to break a guitar. It takes him 15 minutes. By the time it's over, it's like, big deal. I think that's guitar murder. I think guitars have souls. I don't think any of that stuff's cool at all. Instruments have souls. Why would you ever want to murder a guitar? I think it's pointless. Haven't you ever seen The Who? The Who was like the first band that I know of, the first mainstream band to like go crazy on stage and smash up the drums and stuff. Mainly their drummer, Keith Moon. So, and if you didn't know, Dale and Buzz Osborne from the Melvins were like huge Who fans. Matter of fact, the Melvins started as a Who cover band. Kurt and Tracy continued living together for over a month until Tracy could get enough money to get an apartment in Tacoma, which was closer to work, but Kurt wasn't at the apartment much. Usually he was staying over at the home of Toby Vale, one of only a handful of girlfriends Kurt ever had. Kurt says he slept with a total of 2 women on all of Nirvana's tours. Perhaps he had learned a lesson from an incident that occurred on the band's second U.S. tour. After realizing that their audience at a sleazy dive in Iowa was mostly frat jock people, Kurt downed a big jug of Long Island iced tea during a particularly shambolic set. Afterward, they all stumbled over to someone's house and spent the night. Kurt met a girl. We had sex in the van in front of the house, and I woke up in the morning to the sound of breaking glass. Kurt says it turned out to be her boyfriend with a hammer, smashing out the windows of the van. We were stark naked, covered in glass, wondering what we should do. He was walking around the van screaming, "Bitch, bitch, I'm going to kill you." But then he just took off. Probably like came to his senses and thought, the police are going to come and arrest me. Maybe this girl isn't worth it. I don't know. That's a crazy ass story though. That'd be frightening. Dude with a hammer. Kurt had been looking for a dynamic and artistic girlfriend like Toby. She had her own fanzine and was busy helping to start the Riot Girl movement, a group of young women dedicated to promoting female empowerment through music, fanzines, and eventually the national media with her friend Kathleen Hanna, who at the time, by the way, and Kathleen Hanna even admitted this probably within the last 2 to 3 years in a show she was doing. At the same time she was preaching feminism, I'm not talking about Toby Vale, talking about Kathleen Hanna. And while she's friends with Kurt Cobain, she's preaching all this girl empowerment, whatever, feminism, hardcore feminism. And she was a stripper. So, talk about your all-time contradictions, Kathleen Hanna. Through Toby, Kurt began to investigate feminism and other social and political causes. I thought I was in love again, says Kurt, and it was just wishful thinking. A couple of months after the Smart Sessions, Krist called up Butch Vig and asked him if he'd be interested in producing a major label record with them at some point. Vig said sure. Meanwhile, back at Sub Pop, Jonathan Poneman wanted another Nirvana single. Dive, the B-side, was called from the Vig sessions. Dive reprised the best elements of Bleach, the grinding guitar sound, the high, desperate growling vocals, the deliciously leaden riff. It was pop music, but it was very, very heavy pop music. Dive in me, Kurt wailed. For the A-side, Kurt wanted to take advantage of the fact that Tad was in the studio with Jack and Dino and record a song while Tad was on dinner break. Tad Doyle vehemently disliked the idea, but Dino managed to talk him into it. In 1 hour, on July 11th, 1990, they did the basics for Sliver using Tad's drums, bass, and guitar. Sliver featured drummer Dan Peters of Mudhoney, who were on hiatus while guitarist Steve Turner decided whether he wanted to pursue a graduate degree. The band auditioned a couple of drummers before Peters, already a veteran of many Seattle bands, an affable fellow known for his fleet and powerful stick work. He had heard that Nirvana was looking for a drummer and bumped into Shelley at a bar and asked if she'd mention he was available. They started playing with Peters soon after. It definitely felt good to play with someone who was rhythmically competent, says Kurt, but it wasn't quite perfect. For practice, Kurt came up to Seattle from Olympia, and Krist came from Tacoma, and they practiced in Peter's truly grungy rehearsal room in an industrial building in South Seattle, 1st Avenue South and Spokane Street, known as the Dutchman, the very room where countless bands have rehearsed before and since, among them early bands such as Bundle of Hiss, Feast, Room 9, as well as the Screaming Trees, Tad Love Battery, Love Battery is a good band, and 7 Year Bitch. If grunge had a birthplace, this was it. Rehearsals were brief and to the point, and little was said. As far as drums went, Kurt and Krist were of the bigger is better school, while Peters had a great sounding but small drum kit that couldn't keep up with the sonic onslaught. I'd be in the practice space with them, and the amplifier was turned up to 10, says Peters. They'd always be going, I can't hear that bass drum. Yeah, well, no shit, you can't hear the bass drum. I can't even hear the bass drum. One day, Kurt and Krist brought Peters a huge but dilapidated drum set to play. Particular about what he played, Peters would take only the bass drum. If I knew that they were really that serious, I would have pursued another drum kit somehow, says Peters, but I wouldn't play this big hunk of shit they wanted me to play. Peters began to see the writing on the wall. Still, he did play on Sliver, a key track in the Nirvana repertoire. Like many of Kurt's songs, Sliver seems to be autobiographical. It's about a boy who's left with his grandparents for the evening while his mother goes out. He can't eat, he doesn't want to play, he just wants to go home. He falls asleep and wakes up in his mother's arms. Even the cover of the single is a picture of a transparent man, as if to say that the song within enabled the listener to see right through Kurt. They had written it with Peters one day at practice. It came together within a matter of minutes, with Kurt coming up with the lyrics in typical fashion just before they recorded it. The chemistry was definitely there with Danny, Krist, and I, says Kurt. We could have ended up writing some really good songs together. Let's see why they didn't pick Dan Peters to be their drummer, though. It was a bit of an experiment. I decided I wanted to write the most ridiculous pop song that I had ever written, says Kurt. It was like a statement in a way. I had to write a real pop song and release it on a single to prepare people for the next record. I wanted to write more songs like that. Wow, he's thinking ahead. Like, I don't care what people say about Kurt Cobain, man. He was a thinker. He was a planner. And he was not lazy. Like, this dude was super ambitious, and he didn't become famous on accident like people like to think, you know. Kurt Cobain made himself famous. Kurt was listening to a lot of pop-oriented music at that point, including the legendary Seattle garage band, the Sonics. Sonics are killer, man. and the Smithereens. He was also delving deep into the REM catalog. The Sonics are like really, or maybe I'm thinking of the Wipers. Well, they're both pretty kick-ass, especially for as old of a bands as they are. They were like really ahead of their time. It was the most literal lyric Kurt had ever written. For some reason, it's one of the easiest songs for people to comprehend because it's that way, he says, implying that he doesn't understand why people don't grasp his more abstract songs just as easily. That's why I choose not to write that way. I don't like things that are so obvious. The only elusive aspect of the song is the title, which Kurt says he picked because I had a feeling that if I called it Sliver, most people would call it Silver. Kurt is still very pleased with everything about the track. It has a massive naivete to it, he says. It was done so fast and raw and perfect that I don't think we could capture that again, even if we decided to re-record it. Yeah, it's funny that Kurt was trolling people pre-internet, right? It's just one of those recordings. Page turner. This is the last page of the chapter, guys. That happened, and you can't try to reproduce it. It had that childlike quality that Kurt loved in the bands he heard on K Records, like Beat Happening and Young Marble Giants. Many, including Wendy, believe the song is autobiographical, but Kurt says he doesn't recall being afraid of going to his grandparents' house. He may be disingenuous here, because the real point of the song is the anguished cry as the child is reunited with his mother. The song also pointed toward a new songwriting direction. The song was grungy enough, but it was also very tightly composed, a very pop song as opposed to the rock riff-oriented music the band had played thus far. Tacked on to the end of the 7-inch version of Sliver is a hilarious snippet of conversation between Jonathan Poneman and a freshly awoken and very hungover Krist Novoselic. Krist recorded the exchange by accident on his answering machine one afternoon. Peters played one gig with Nirvana, a September 22nd show at the Motorsports International and Garage. Oh yeah, I remember this. I don't remember it. I wasn't there, but I remember reading about this show. It's later in the book. Peters played one gig with Nirvana, a September 22nd show at the Motorsports International and Garage, a former parking garage, now demolished, at Minor and Howell Streets. Nirvana headlined Over the Doors and their one-time mentors, the Melvins. Ooh, I wonder how that felt for Dale and Buzz. They were like Kurt and Krist mentors. Like, Kurt looked up to them. Kurt learned a lot from them, and then Kurt comes up, and now they're opening for him. It's sometimes I sense a little animosity and Buzz, at least, but I almost feel like he has the right, but that's a whole other video. I am also going to make another Friends Who Envied Kurt Cobain video and update it and make it way better than the one that is currently. It's just an old video that I made, and I didn't do it proper justice because I didn't know a lot then that I know now, about the relationship between Buzz and Kurt. With 1,500 customers, it was their biggest show in Seattle at that point. The band debuted several songs from the big demos, including Pay to Play, which became Stay Away, Imodium, In Bloom. There was no stage security at all, so people would climb up and dive off, but not before accidentally marring almost every song by knocking over a mic or bumping into a musician. It was just nuts. In the audience was Dave Grohl. And we'll pick up from there in chapter 7. It begins with the words David Eric Grohl, so you know what that's going to be about. That was chapter 6 of Come As You Are. In the next video, we're going to be continuing the Nirvana series Lost Episodes. The Lost Episodes, A Lack of Blood, we're going to talk about the nanny, the BBC interview. We're going to get into some case files of Tom Grant and talk about actually about a week after Kurt's death. There's a story that I want to tell recounted by Tom Grant within his notes that he gave to me a long time ago on a USB drive. And it's going to be a pretty cool video. Again, thank you if you stuck with me. I've been really sick for a while. Shitty things happen. Electricity, some cords fused together in the recording studio. That's why I'm sitting on my couch. Patrons, members, thank you for sticking with me, even though I wasn't uploading, and you guys knew I was sick, and I really appreciate that. I guess there's not much else to say. Besides, I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.